So you may remember in the last video we dismantled the Thunder Tiger engine ready for degreasing and preparation because it was totally filthy. Well, this is now the same engine. It's been cleaned up using nothing more than fairy liquid and water and a good sluicing in nitro fuel. I use old nitro fuel just to clean it up because the fuel actually removes the fuel residues left by the engine. So this has now been cleaned up. The only thing I've done on top of this is I've given the exhaust manifold a coat of black paint. The black paint I use it's a high heat paint, a heat resistant paint, so it won't peel off when the engine started. So here's the engine. I didn't need to take the piston and the crankcase out. Instead, what I've done is I've oiled it all up so that it all works fine. So that's our piston and engine, etc. And we're going to put it back together. So the first thing we're going to do, keep it nice and simple, is to put the back plate on. And the back plate literally fits in and sits on with the pull start in the right position. You see, it won't quite slot on yet until I've rotated it to get it into position. Once it's rotated into position, there we are, like that, then it can be screwed on. I've got a selection of screws here. The slightly smaller ones are the ones we need for the back plate. So there's just 4 screws that go in onto the back plate on this one. They have to be the slightly smaller ones. If they're any longer, then when the pull start is put on, they actually do foul the pull start, and we don't really want that to happen. So this keeps it nice and simple. Two, 3, and then just one more after this one. You'll notice also that the starter shaft is still in position, and the starter shaft just turns on the one-way bearing. I did check the status of the one-way bearing, and the one-way bearing is absolutely fine. So that's perfectly usable, which means that when we pull the pull start, all should be good. I'll just double check those bolts. 1, 2, 3, and 4. There we are. So now, if I turn the starter shaft, you should be able to see the crankshaft turning and the pistons moving up and down, so that's ready. If I turn it the other way, the one-way bearing kicks in and nothing moves, which is exactly as we want it to be. And it feels nice and smooth as well, which is what we need. So the next part of the job is very simply, we're going to put the cylinder head on and seal the top up so that no stuff can get in there. So we need the head gasket. Head gasket is very important. An engine won't run properly without a head gasket. This particular one is aluminium. Some are copper, some are even brass, but this particular one is aluminium. In fact, I'm going to put it on here like that because it'll be an easier fit. There we are, and squash that in. Make sure it's nice and secure. And then these 4 bolts here are the head bolts. These are slightly longer ones. So we'll just pop them into the engine as one. Always, when it comes to lining an engine up, always leave the bolts really loose, and then just tighten them down slowly. You see, I'm putting these in the diagonal corners so that the head is held on properly. 1, 2. They're only on loosely. Another one in there. 3. And one more, which goes on in here, number 4. There we go. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I can start to tighten them up. So I'm going to go 1, an opposite, 2, and then 3, an opposite, 4. They don't have to be over tightened, just nipped. And you'll find now that when you try and turn that over, it's much harder. In fact, I can hardly turn that over now with the starter shaft. That's because the engine now has compression. If you look in there, you can see the glow plugs in there. So that engine is now ready to run, or pretty much ready to run. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to put the carburetor on. The carburetor also has been cleaned. I have actually dismantled this and given it a really good clean and put it back together again. I didn't go through that as part of the video, but that's fairly self-explanatory. So that's back together. The only thing to bear in mind is if ever you do a carburetor renewal, or a carburetor clean, you need to set the settings of the needles back to default. In the case of the Thunder Tiger engine, the default is 2.5 turns out. So this screw here is seated all the way in and then out 2.5 full turns, and then this screw here is, I can't remember now, I should know this, shouldn't I? It's flush with the casing and then out 2.5 turns, I believe is correct for that one, but I stand to be corrected if anybody knows different. So that's it, the carburetor's on, ready to run. So all we need to do now is put the flywheel on. So in this case it's the flywheel that goes on there, and then that one goes on there. Keep it nice and simple. Then there's a nut that goes on here. Oops, put it the other way around. You can see there's a recess for a circlip on there, so I have to put the nut on the right way around. And I'm going to use, this is a nitro tool I've got, but the nitro tool fits the nut. So I'm just going to move over to the vise. I don't know if you can see that here. Just going to move over to the vise, put the engine in the vise by the flywheel, and then just give it a quick tight. That's all it needs to be, nice and tight. So that's ready to go. Let's come back over here. Excuse my wobbly camera mount, that's the way it happens. So that's now ready to go. So on top of there we can now put the clutch. I'm using the same clutch as original. It's the clutch is actually fine. It's was a bit dirty, but it's cleaned up now. So we use the clutch. The clutch goes on there, followed by a circlip. And the circlip stops the clutch from falling off. So again, I'll just use a pair of pliers and clip it in place. Oops. It's like it jumped out of my thumb, isn't it? And we'll put that circlip on. Come on, butterfingers. I'm trying to do it in front of a video, you see. I'm going to use a bigger pair of pliers. There we go. There we are. And the circlip's in position. You can see that on the front of the engine. And then just to finish off with, we put a washer on. The washer just separates the front, the clutch from the front, from the bell housing, and then the bell housing bearing goes on. The bell housing itself goes on top of the bearing, and then finally there's a washer, and then very last there's a circlip that goes on the front of the engine. And again, if I just clip that on with a pair of pliers, I'll see if I can use the small ones. I'm afraid it's getting close to winter and the light is not particularly good, so I hope you can see this on the video. There we are. So that's all in position. You can see there, if I give that a spin, the bell housing is spinning quite nicely, so that's ready to go. That just leaves a couple of jobs just to finish off with. The first of which is nice and easy. It's this one, and this again has had a good clean up. You might remember this sprung out previously, so it's now been rewound and it works quite nicely. So we're going to put this onto the back of the engine, making sure it's into position. There we are. And again, I need the 4 bolts for this. Where's my screwdriver? Just a matter of lining it up with the holes. It's there somewhere. Come on, get lined up. Once you get one in, the rest will follow quite easily. There we are, there's one in. That's one. Now opposites again, because it keeps it nice and straight. Make sure it's lined up. 2. 3 goes in here, and then one more after this, and the pull start should be into position. This is for the purpose of the video. I think I might have told you this before. This is a Thunder Tiger Pro engine. This particular one is a Pro 12, but the Pro 12 is the same as the Pro 15. Obviously the bore is slightly different, but they're the same engine, so the same principle applies for both. Now we'll just do a double check, make sure that works all right. Yeah, it's a little bit loose on the pull start. I will have to tidy that up before we start using the engine, which I will do. But from there's just one other job to do, and that is the exhaust. Now for the exhaust, I'm going to use a new gasket. I always use a new gasket when I'm replacing an exhaust because, believe it or not, it's very important, simply because it stops the car getting covered in the mess that we saw it in when we started to do this strip down. You might remember it was all gummy and horrible. A lot of that gummy and horribleness is actually due to engine residue. And the engine residue leaks out from the exhaust because it's oily. It then sets and sets it on anything it can find, including, there we are, can't get on there now. I have to use a different screwdriver, including the car and the engine, which is why it was so difficult. So by putting an exhaust in here, we can guarantee that all of the exhaust fumes, there we are, will go out of the exhaust where they're supposed to go and not all over the engine. There we are. And that's 2. I'm going to use a slightly bigger screwdriver on this one, only because it's wearing a little bit thin, so we'll just make that a little bit bigger like that. There we are, hopefully you can see that. And there we are, and this particular exhaust goes around the back. So we're just going to attach that on there like that. I'm going to put it on the bench for a moment, and we're going to attach it on here like this. So there's number 1. And before we go too tight, we'll just match up number 2, make sure number 2 is also attached. Come on, you're in the hold. I can't see where you are. Maybe it's me getting old, but my eyesight is getting terrible. I think that's it. Let's find out. There we go, so that's getting tighter now. You can see the exhaust being pulled in onto the manifold. I'll just give this one another tighten so it keeps it even. There we are, pull it in tight. And this one again. Nice and tight. 1, 2. There we are, you can see a nice clean manifold in there, nicely manifold. Exhaust is on tight. I'll just slip this on. This will be cable tied on when we put the car back together. And that's pretty much it. That's the reassembly of the engine. There's just one part I've remembered, and that's this one here, which is the cover that goes over the carburetor mechanism. I'll just put that on there like that, just to stop the dust getting into the carburetor. There we are, and the car's moving fine. The engine pull starts, as we know, and it turns over. You can turn it over by hand from here, not by the starter shaft, and that's fine. So now this is ready to go back into the car. The car is also being cleaned and refurbished, and the next part is putting together the car. So we'll cover that in a different video. Thank you for watching. Thank you.